It's been 10 days since the Southport stabbings. We've seen protests, riots and counter-protests all across the country. Last night, police were anticipating as many as 100 protests. As we know, the expected disorder didn't take place, thankfully. Instead, we saw huge counter-protests in places like Walthamstow in East London, Aldershot in Hampshire and in Bristol in the west of England. Ultimately, it seemed as though there was little to protest against for the anti-fascist protesters. But we're becoming more of that in a moment. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer pledged to continue supporting law enforcement efforts when asked about whether it was time to address underlying concerns about mass migration.
The first priority is safety and security of our communities. I was very keen that we're able to demonstrate that if you're involved in disorder, within days you'll be in the criminal justice system, and some people starting long terms of imprisonment. That needs to continue, and so that is my sole focus.
Now, Sir Keir Starmer has faced allegations of two-tier policing in recent days. I put this to the senior Labour Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, last night on this programme.
I don't accept the idea of two-tier policing. I don't accept the idea of two-tier sentencing. You break the law, you face the consequences. That's the rule of law we have in this country. And what the government is saying today is anyone thinking of going out and committing violent offences, you will feel the full force of that law.
Now, my first guest tonight is Dan Hodges, a senior political journalist on the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. And he said today in the Daily Mail that the only way to reclaim our streets is by being tough on the causes of extremism. Dan Hodges, welcome to the show. Do you think Labour is right to say it's a far-right issue, or is the problem or concern about migration, if that's what it is, deeper than that?
Yeah, I mean, Labour's definitely right to say it's a far-right issue. I mean, the vast bulk of the violence we've seen, not the entirety, but the vast bulk of it, has quite clearly been organised by the far right. I mean, I've spoken to Labour ministers, I've spoken to previous ministers in the previous administration, Conservative administration, and they all agree on that. But as I said in the piece today, it's not simply a question of tackling, addressing the far right in law and order terms, although obviously that's very, very important. We have to also address the things that give rise to the far right, give succour to the far right, and give oxygen to the far right. And as I said, to use that old sort of Tony Blair phrase, we've got to be tough on far-right extremism and tough on the causes of far-right extremism.
We've heard for a while now from the police. They've been concerned about it for a while, haven't they? Do you think Labour get the concern about migration on the streets, get the concern about the last government's policy of putting migrants in hotels? That was a flashpoint. And are they willing to learn and to listen at some point? Right now, they're just trying to keep the streets safe. We get that.
Yeah, no, they definitely get it. I mean, again, I was speaking to Labour advisors today who were making that point. And actually, if you see right from the beginning, I mean, even in the Queen's speech, Labour and Keir Starmer have put measures tackling immigration, particularly tackling illegal immigration, have put that at the heart of the Queen's speech. So this is definitely something that they understand. But what they've been absolutely say very keen, they're absolutely clear about is that they've had to firstly get to grips with the issue in law and order terms, and secondly be clear that they don't give any suggestion or any succour to those going out onto the streets that in any way what the violence or the disorder is any way legitimate. But I think you're absolutely right. I think moving forward now, once law and order is restored, then, as I say, we are going to have to start to look at some of the underlying causes. But I do think Labour ministers recognise that. Now, whether or not they can come up with the policy prescriptions to deal with it is obviously a separate issue.
I mean, so far, Keir Starmer is played into his hands. He's a former top prosecutor in the country. He knows how to get the CPS working. Watching people being jailed so rapidly, days after the violence, has been extraordinary. It may have contributed to last night's no riots last night, which is great news. I mean, the real challenge for him is the political challenge, which he's less certain on.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of issues. I mean, as I say in the piece today, I mean, the number of issues. One is obviously the fact that we've seen the way that social media has been utilised. I mean, first in terms of spreading propaganda, but also literally in terms of moving people around, in terms of the rioting on the ground. And one of the things the police have been very alarmed about is the way that the rioters have used social media to, in a sense, stay one step ahead of some of the policing efforts, but especially initially. So that's one of the things they're going to have to look about. The other thing, frankly, that's going to have to be addressed is in my view, there is a social inequality element to this. If you look at where the riots have been taking place, they are frankly primarily within white working class communities where are issues of serious social deprivation. That's going to have to be addressed. And the third issue, obviously, is the underlying tensions that there are in relation to immigration. Now, Labour, obviously, one of the first policies was to scrap the Rwanda scheme. Labour ministers say that's because it was very expensive and wasn't working. But the question
was a deterrent, though, possibly. It was in Ireland,
well, that's
wasn't
the thing.
it?
I mean, the Labour minister's argument, I think, not necessarily unfairly, was it wasn't much of a deterrent because we hadn't managed to get a single person back to Rwanda. But that's one of the key policy areas that Keir Starmer's going to have to address, and by far, I think, the trickiest one.
And have they got the answers on immigration? They're looking at, I think, houses of multiple occupation, possibly Operation Scatter's being talked about, instead of hotels, putting asylum seekers into the community more than they are at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I know some people are quite concerned about that policy, but I think the key thing is, it is going to come down to whether or not Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper can get to grips with the small boats issue. I mean, that's the biggest number one issue. Now, we've obviously seen...
It's not the biggest, but the most significant.
Yeah,
it's only 50,000 a year compared to hundreds of thousands
no,
of
exactly, but
migrants.
I think it's the biggest in political terms, and I think it's the biggest in terms of the underlying discontent that we see. Not discontent from the rioters, we can forget them, but the ordinary law-abiding British citizens who would have nothing to do with the rioting, but there is real concern.
The offer from this country is come across the channel and get put up in a hotel. I mean, it is not hard to understand why it's appealing to come here.
Yeah, I think it's slightly more complicated than that, Chris. I mean, I think it's people are coming here. They're claiming asylum, and they have to be housed whilst.
Yes, of course.
And obviously we have exactly. We have the significant we obviously have the significant backlog which Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer have inherited. But to come back to the point, you're absolutely right. The key for Labour is they've done away with the Rwanda scheme. They've said it's not working. Keir Starmer has his own plan, which is obviously centred around smashing the criminal gangs. The question will be, obviously they've only been in 4 weeks. When they've been in 4 months, a year, 2 years, will their policy have worked? If it has, they'll get huge political credit for it. If they haven't, then it's going to become a very, very serious political problem.
But so far, maybe Sir Keir Starmer's passed this test, and it was a severe test on his authority in the country.
Yeah, I think it was...
So far,
yeah, it was, exactly. Obviously, we'll have to see how things play out the weekend, but it was being framed as his first test, and you touched on it. I certainly think that the fast-tracking of the sentences and the sort of the exemplary sentencing that we've put through, I think that did probably have some sort of impact yesterday. And I think that's to Keir Starmer's credit.
Yeah. Dan Hodges, Mail Sunday columnist, thank you for joining us.